Good afternoon. I would like to thank, first of all, Helena for inviting us here. And I heard that here are also people from Sculpture Quadrennial, because I would like to thank them also, since these sculptural events really inspired me when I was a teenager, when I was growing up in Riga. So first of all, I'm going to introduce shortly myself. I'm Evita Vasiļjeva. I'm born in Riga, but I'm an artist from Amsterdam. I'm living there. I'm working mainly with sculptures. At the moment, there's one. This work is exhibited in a railway museum, and I'm an artist from Amsterdam, and I'm mainly a sculptor, and I'm working with sculptures installations, and quite a lot mainly based on material. And I joined this conference to be invited here because art in public space is a subject that really interests me, because I realized that while we were preparing for this conference, that I'm a very isolated artist and mainly working alone in my studio. And maybe Christel, you could talk a bit about yourself.
Yeah. My name is Christel Vesters, and I'm an art critic and a curator from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I was thinking about what to tell you, and I could tell you about the projects that I've worked on art in public space. This is a project by Janne van Heeswijk. We organized a symposium in 2003 with the ICA in London called the Ideal Participatory Art Project. Or I could talk to you about my work as a curator at the Netherlands Architecture Institute, or for SCOR, which is the foundation for art in public space in the Netherlands. Or I could talk to you about my involvement with the Biennale for Social Design. But I'm not sure if that would be the most interesting contribution I could make to this symposium. So when Evita invited me to collaborate with her, and when she told me a bit about the cultural landscape in Riga, I became acutely aware of my position of being an outsider. Maybe an outsider with some years of experience and expertise in the field of art and public space, but an outsider to the context of Riga. And if I've learned one thing over the past years about art and public space, it is that location and context is everything. So for me to come here and tell you what I think art in public space within an Eastern European context would be, well, I think that would be a bit presumptuous, to say the least. So maybe it suffices to say that my engagement with art in public space, its discourses, contexts and histories, is very much defined and limited by a Western European tradition of public art practices. More specifically, on the one hand, the tradition of public art programs initiated by the city governments in the 70s, this is an example, which we know is the 1%. And on the other hand, this tradition of community arts, which originated from the arts and education programs also from the 70s. So most of my ideas and opinions about what art in the public realm could be or should be stems from a dialogue between these two traditions. Other than that, I think it's extremely important for any locality, city, community to produce and formulate its own practices and discourses. I think in light of what we can call the persuasiveness and pervasiveness of the global art world, it too often happens that we simply copy the dominant global discourse or dominant global practices, conforming to a global aesthetic that seems to belong everywhere and anywhere and nowhere. I think we have to be very aware and even critical of these forms of self-colonialization. So when Evita and me started speculating on what an artwork in the public space of Riga might look like, how it might function, we agreed that whatever we came up with, it should originate from Riga's local context, whatever that may be. So for the next 25 minutes or so, what you'll be listening to is an artist's search to create a meaningful work of art in the city of Riga. During this process, a dialogue will unfold between her and me, me being the semi-detached consigliere who asks questions and places some critical footnotes. but we wanted to use the method of speculation. So when we speculate, we imagine what could be, either projecting something onto a blank canvas or onto an existing situation. The Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas once remarked that he often feels perpetually torn between realism and a kind of speculative fervor. Of course, the real Koolhaas refers to has to do with economic and administrative concerns that limit his imagination of what could be, and not, for instance, the social or historical real of the future building site. In essence, Koolhaas, like many of the architects of his generation, still operate from a modernist top-down position, meaning that they design for a space, not necessarily from a space. Very often these new buildings are designed in the studio with 3D models and built from scratch on a cleared-out plot in the city. And we all know this kind of gentrification projects, where old city is torn down, old buildings are torn down to create something new, shiny, polished. In the last 10 years or so, there has been a significant shift in the field of architecture in Holland. Younger generations of architects who believe that architecture should contribute to a sustainable city focused on use value rather than aesthetical form. They have started developing projects from the bottom up, collaborating with local communities, for instance, or converting existing architectural structures, literally and figuratively speaking, building onto what's already there. In other words, they started to speculate from what's already given in a certain situation. But let's get back to Riga.
Yes. So that's Riga. When I introduced Christel's image of Riga, that was like a first image where, like what we get normally. And when I think of Riga, there's this cliche or stereotype of it. And these are images, like how Riga tries to represent itself as a nice city. And as an artist, first of all, I was thinking of the content of it as a nice location and how I could contribute in it.
Yeah. So, what would be your first thoughts? What were your first thoughts about an art project for Riga?
Yes.
How did you approach this kind of hypothetical assignment?
Since the conference is called "What's in the Garden," so I started by thinking of a context of garden. So, what the garden means, and Riga is a very green city, and nature is very valued there. So park is like a first thing that comes to my mind. But somehow I was always feeling kind of uneasy about parks. I find them almost too perfect, and I find them kind of dislocated from the town, and they're not inspiring for me as an artist to work with, because I have nothing to hold on there, because this location I find it isolated from the rest of the city, how I feel about it. So when I was thinking about monuments and parks and what Riga already has there, I realized, for example, Rhine is standing in a square, but in my research I realized also that a sculpture for Rheinis is also represented in a graveyard. And then I started to think what would be then the difference between graveyards and parks, like they both are kind of isolated situations.
I think that's a good observation. So what do we expect from a work of art when it enters the public realm? And what's the difference between a monument and a work of art? I think previous speakers also referred to it. And I like your comparison between sculpture, gardens and graveyards. For me, sometimes it does feel like a sculpture sitting in a park belongs more to the past than to the present. It has something detached, something non-specific about art in parks, like this one. As if the object can swap spaces or swap places without a problem. But this doesn't only apply to Riga or Riga parks. In the Netherlands and in Belgium too, there are parks solely dedicated to sculpture, like the sculpture park Diepenheim in Belgium, the open air exhibition Sonsbeek around Arnhem. There are many museums that have their own sculpture gardens, so like this one in Krullenmüller, the Fiscale Appel. From an art historical point of view, it's easy to explain Western art historical point of view. It's easy to explain why parks seem to provide such a natural habitat for artworks when they move outside of this museum space. There's a long-standing tradition of portrait sculptures and other monuments decorating the gardens and palaces and public parks, made of solid materials and placed on a pedestal. These sculptures fit comfortably within the bourgeois idea of leisure, beautification and cultural heritage, even the idea of enlightening the publics, educating them. Furthermore, throughout history, gardens, parks and the countryside have been perceived and cultivated as a place of beauty, contemplation, purity, the idea of nature, healthy body, healthy for mind, the other way around, in short, a kind of Arcadia. Whereas the industrialized, overcrowded, noisy, smelly and sinful city, being the opposite, it's dystopia. Even in contemporary art, it seems that many contemporary artists and curators have adopted this garden, with all the aforementioned associations, as their preferred extension of the traditional gallery space. A common practice here is that outdoor sculptures are simply an enlarged version of a sculpture originally designed for the museum gallery. This was not originally designed for the museum gallery, but you get my drift. But I would like to argue, what's the difference between placing a sculpture in a garden or in a museum space? How does the sculpture change in terms of its publicness, the presence in the public realm, or in terms of its viewing conditions, or even how does it change its identity as an artwork? What often surprises me is that contemporary artists, when invited to participate in outdoor exhibitions like Sculpture, Münster or Documenta, still adopt this strategy. The Paul McCarthy. I would like to argue, what I like to get at is that these examples, there's little or no dialogue between the work of art and its context, its location. I don't think they can be considered site or context specific. Even if I push it further, there's no urgency for these works to be at that specific place, nothing that binds them. Of course, this was the bridge from IYY, Bridge Without a Name. It's site-specific in that it fits into the landscape and adopts a form and function that's appropriate to this environment. But what makes it site-specific in terms of the outlook of the space and the social function of the space? What makes it a public work of art rather than a work of art in a public space?
But if we move then from parks, then the next location that comes to my mind is squares. I find squares already much more interesting because it's a more complex space to deal with. It has its particular location and points of view to approach it, and sculpture become in the way of it. And it's like a ensemble of different elements in one space that it's interesting to work with. And for example, the next image, I thought like Riga, this particular location really interests me because it has 5 roads connecting to each other, and there's also a green spot of land that just almost asks for a sculpture. And also the walls, there are like lots of wall space that now are occupied by commercials, but could be included in ensemble, some sort of a large complex sculpture that could extend actually on the walls. And I think that's something very special in Riga and very interesting could be to take in account.
Yeah, so we've seen this example before, and thinking about art in town squares or public squares, it brings in a whole different set of questions, and there's no avoiding the potential interaction with the public. So I had to think about what the Turkish architect and theoretician Orhan Eshen said about town squares during the riots in Gezi Park and Taksim Square in 2013. He said, "Their historical function as a place of gathering, of people meeting, is still the same today. So if gardens offer a place of leisure, of solitude and contemplation, often squares are sites for protest and revolution." In this case, of course, with Sarah, there was protest because it kind of intervened in the square, and it was this because it disrupted the normal traffic of commuters passing the plaza and it blocked their view and path across the space. But he said, Sarah, the artist said, the sculpture was meant to interact with the commuter passing through the plaza, a location usually passed through quickly on the way to somewhere else. He also said, Sarah, the viewer becomes aware of himself through this sculpture and of his movement through the plaza. As he moves, the sculpture changes. Contraction and expansion of the sculpture result from the viewer's movement. Step by step, the perception not only of the sculpture but of the entire environment changes. So although this statement by Sarah refers to the disruptive effect of the sculpture on people's sense of place and their perception of the sculpture as they move along, he clearly wanted the sculpture to intervene, to interact and to disrupt status quo, the everyday use of his public space. And I think it's interesting to juxtapose Sarah's comment with what Vito Aconci has said about his sculpture in Den Haag. Aconci says, on the street, art in public space could become something that you hardly notice, like a street lantern or a fire extinguisher. Sometime later, when you have passed the object, you might vaguely remember something, although you cannot exactly say where that memory came from, like a tune or melody that lingers in your mind. So I want to get back to this idea of town squares, Vita, being pregnant with layers of history, sometimes even burdened with history, or historical periods people would rather not be remembered of. They even might want to erase. How do you think you're going to deal with that? Do you think there's a responsibility of art to engage with these kind of heavy layers?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, for example, this square I find very interesting because it has so many layers in historical and also functional. And I think art could be the way how to deal with problematic locations also. I would imagine that one option could be for art to emphasize the problem of it, but problematizing it even more. Or
how would you do that?
Like I thought was a very interesting example of, she's not here, Arya Miller, when she showed next to her... this contemporary sculpture that Borgay, this sculpture was placed next to this historical sculpture, and I saw that it's immediately emphasized also historical aspects and with this contemporary art. That's something really contrast and adds another layer to what is there already. I thought it was a really good example.
Can you say something about the elements that are on the square? I assume most Latvian people know, but...
Yeah, I just find it very beautiful that this rifleman sculpture, how it actually contradicts with the Soviet time occupation museum architecture, whereas right now there is an occupation museum. And I just noticed that people are really sensitive about this occupation museum. But since I've been living away, and I feel like distance now to everything what's in Riga, and I see things in a different way. I extract beauty of them from visuals, not from their context anymore. Yeah, for example, during this research about public art in public space, then I noticed tiny details was being used in Monument to Freedom that all my years I've been passing through and never paid too much attention to it, and for the first time I noticed that in the middle part of it, the stripe is actually constructed from a glass. All these tiny blocks that are composed inside of it. So I thought it was amazing, beautiful detail to look at this sculpture from a different perspective, that it can be so delicate actually. And I wanted to point out this delicacy, I think, out of like just the message that it's a monument of freedom. that's always been just like as a first layer to read it.
I noticed that when we talked about possible artwork for Riga, that you were very focused on materiality and on the spatial aspects of a location, or the architectural context, or the visible elements, what defines a space, the physical aspects of location. And I wonder how you would deal with more immaterial qualities, immaterial dimensions. Like how would you approach a square as a social space?
Yeah, I have difficulties. It seems like I think of a sculpture as a volume, as a form, texture, light, color. So, yeah, I have. At first, I'm like, I have difficulty to think as a social sculpture, or what the social aspect has to do with it.
Yeah, because I did some before we came here. It was my first visit to Riga, so I had to do some desktop research, and I found all these different maps of Riga with information about the city. So, for instance, this map, it's a map of the dominant architectural styles in the city per area, but it's not just a map of different types of buildings, but it also gives you an overview of the different historical periods and how they layer by layer have constructed the city and the outlook of the city. So, and as we know, architectural styles are closely connected to power structures and overriding ideologies. Or this map, which is a public transport network, which is another side of the city, which is invisible on street level, but very much impacts the social and economical life of the city. Like this one, which really looks like an organism, something with blood veins or something, but it's actually the map of noise pollution produced by vehicles in the city. So clearly the city is more than merely a sculpture or a spatial construction, it's also a lived space. How did we deal with that?
Yeah, I remember that we found some sort of a compromise on this map, because that has this physicality of problematic zones in Riga. The ones are like wastelands. What else was there? Buildings that are supposed to be torn down or reconstructed, and I thought it was a very interesting actually element to think about, that it has all these not so pretty locations in town, and it creates another system in the map also. It's another Riga.
Yeah, I had to think about this project that Stefano Boeri did. He's an Italian architect. He went to Tokyo with his students in 2000, and he asked the students, to make a map of all the different voids in the built structure of the city. So from the space in between buildings, because in Tokyo buildings are not built next to each other, but there's a little void because of earthquakes. The canals, and to map them out. And what interests me in that project is not because it's just another take on the city, but it's open spaces. He was interested in how these open spaces were used in a more informal way. And I think when you look at the real estate, the booming real estate economy in Tokyo, it's interesting to map out these empty spaces that are not formally used, and they're very expensive empty spaces. And there's another project. What do I do?
Just like,
yeah, by a Spanish-Dutch architect called Lara Almersegui, who also made guides to wastelands and empty spaces, and they're everything but beautiful spaces. And it's again, in light of speculation, empty spaces within an urban area, of course, they not only invite us to project, a beautiful sculpture or an artwork or a new building, but they also invite speculation in terms of economic profit. This was another image that we came up with. So how could you imagine these invisible layers to maybe be a material for you as a sculpture? Could you maybe imagine staging a performance or a community art project?
No, that would be really difficult for me. I would invite the performance artist to do it, but I really think that city needs performative elements much more also. That's another way how to look at the town. Creates another layer how to look what is town. Yeah.
That's all kind of performance.
Okay, to come back to Riga as a pretty location. Of course, like at first, like I was thinking like about these nice locations. What's the good side of town? And during the course of our conversation, we realized it has different sides of it. And then, what did we do?
Yeah, Could you imagine making an artwork for a housing area like this?
No, housing area I find very interesting as a complex location with buildings and squares, but I think I've been traumatized by it all my childhood that like I cannot imagine that any artwork can save this space. Like I think it just disappears and drowns, and the artwork just emphasizes this drama in there. Yeah. So only maybe a social project could work there. As a physical form, I don't think it's working there.
I'm asking it because I know in Holland and I know in the UK as well, we have these government-driven, funded, quite heavily funded art projects that invite artists to go into neighborhoods like the Bijlmer, which is similar to this neighborhood, and create something. And they are stimulated to work with the local inhabitants. But there's always such a clash, not only between the artist and the local community, but also, for me at least, on this kind of moral or maybe even ethical level, because you, as an artist, you come in and you do your thing, and maybe you stay 1 or 2 months and then you leave again. So Thomas Hirschhorn did a big project in the Bijlmer in Amsterdam a couple of years ago, and he stayed there for over 6 months. And I think that's the least, if you really want to engage with the life, the everyday life of the community in a less developed area of the city in terms of cultural developed areas of the city, then you have to spend time there. You have to make a real commitment.
But I thought, like, this was, for example, as an interesting way how to include these invisible layers of town, because I find this work really amazing. It's a good sculpture, but it also deals with the social aspects of the location. But yeah, as Helena mentioned already, these sculptures are really problematic to leave, and they are not so pretty to leave them in town. But I think that they talk about all these aspects about public sculpture in public space, and here probably could be our bridge where we could.
Yeah, we had when we started preparing this talk, because now we're giving you the kind of the neat and polished version. But we had some not arguments, but we had some discussions, because I'm convinced that when an artwork moves into the public realm, it should really make a commitment to that public realm, and it has to take into account the public or the audience or the local community as future owners of that object or project. And so whilst I was trying to persuade Evita to maybe come up with a social community project, she said no, I'm a sculptor. So where did you end up after exploring all these different locations and different, kind of questions that raise these different locations? How do you envision an artwork that responds to these different challenges and expectations that we talked about?
So eventually I came up with an alternative, I guess, by thinking of Latvian craftsmen, because I'm really interested also in craft as a form or production of a work and a knowledge that is embedded in humans. And Latvians, they have lots of tradition in wood carving. There are lots of glass craftsmen, and I was inspired also of production of strelnieku piemineklis. A rightful man square, the sculpture in there. And I thought, like, also to take in account the social aspect of what public sculpture should function, if I would collaborate, for example, with craftsmen from Latvia and use their knowledge and skills and somehow together create whatever, a community where we come up, they help me to succeed some sort of a project.
So their knowledge and skill sets would become your material, making something together.
Exactly.
Okay. Did you want to end with Richard Sennett's quote?
Yeah, I was really inspired by Richard Serra, that he said, Richard Sennett, he's a sociologist, and he emphasizes the importance of collaboration, and then people today, they don't collaborate enough. That's why I was collaborating also with you. And he says, everybody is basically the same, express a neutrality-seeking view of the world. The desire to neutralize difference, to domesticate it, arise from anxiety about the difference, which intersects with the economics of global consumer culture. So I could imagine that art is this some sort of art is this thing could create this difference in a community, and also evoke questions to talk about it, but also as a way to be a reason to collaborate.
You also said something about inviting the other, or welcoming the other into.
I don't remember that.
The art, how the artwork could
I don't
be the
think
other.
so.
No? Okay, this was it. Thanks.
Any questions? No questions?
To Evita,
Sorry?
is the question for Evita?
No, it's actually a comment for both of you. So, for me, it's usually half question. I'm usually commenting more than so much of questioning, but there is always question in the comment. So, I was thinking about this first topic that you were talking about, which was the garden, city and the garden, and the monuments in or the artworks in the garden kind of space. And the thing that maybe is a bit hard nowadays in communication with the work is the pedestal of English, the podium, podium on which the artwork is, because I think why there is so many works now that are made that are very much down to the ground, and if they are distracting you, then it's consciously distracting you, that you can't pass it, or that you have to go in it or something. So the point is sometimes maybe is that thing that sometimes from the works from the past that sometimes there is this problem of communication, because we want those sculptures to come down. So when you were showing this famous Balzac's, sculpture from Rodin, then I have seen a picture of Edvard Steiker photographing it when it was not still the way it's now. It was down on the ground and in a moonlight and everything, and it was very. I felt like it would very much that it communicated much more than it is doing now, and I've also seen it, of course, in Paris, many Rodin's works, and they are somewhere up there, and it's very hard to actually till the end interact with them. It's also different times, so I understand why they are on pedestal, but sometimes it becomes very interestingly weird also in Riga parks to see some actually proportion weirdnesses, that the sculpture itself is very tiny, but this podium is huge, and it's not conceptually thought about it like that. It's not, it's not a joke actually. It was seriously made, but it looks like a joke. So there is also these kind of Blomans just nearby. You can go through the park, which has these proportions. I think are very weird. But for me at least. But then there is a very beautiful other example, which is the famous American artist Klaus Oldenburg. And when I was in summer in Paris, then I actually experienced a beautiful thing, which in a way was weird too, that his work, the bicycle, which is, under the ground, and then some of the parts come out, and half of it was made around the fence, because there was some kind of private territories for a moment, and there was some animals, just, like little cows going around and sheep in that territory, which was dislocated from the park. But in that dislocated part was part of Oldenburg's work, which was this bicycle seat place. And they found shade, it was a very hot day, so they were all under it, all the animals, so that they could have some, not sun, like shade, no, shadow, where to, get away from the sun. But in the same time, on other parts, a little girl was jumping up and going down, so it was, even when some part was dislocated, which I don't think it was the Klaus Oldenburg's idea of that work to be now dislocated like that. The part is for the public and part is not for the public. But anyway, it made such an interesting interactions, what was happening there. And I will see if I... And the third comment is about these empty spaces. I totally agree, and I think it's actually absurd situation that is happening now in Riga. There are so many great houses in the center and they're empty, but when you look at the market prices of their even renting those places, it's really, really high. So it's just, it's not even with the art in the public space, but just something about the spaces itself. So yeah, but maybe if I'm going for the questions, then maybe you can comment something, or both of you comment about this podiums, because I think that's also an interesting topic when we talk about artworks in public space.
Yeah, I can say something about that. I think the pedestal you mean, huh? The sokol, yeah. Of course, that's kind of like the frame with a painting. Those are the kind of the traditional modernist ways of distinguishing what is art and what's not art. The wall, the garden, the city streets. But I think the pedestal is just one strategy of framing something as art when it moves out of the white cube. I think there are many other strategies artists might use to still say this is art. And we spoke about it before when Norbert presents, like people start to appreciate things maybe quicker if we don't put it on the pedestal, if we don't label it as art. So I think the pedestal is just one of the many ways that we still feel we need to protect this sacredness of art. Whereas if it moves to a museum space, then it really does enter another space. And I find that very fascinating, how some approaches might still be quite protective. Yeah. But thanks for your comments, it's really good to hear. Yeah.
Shall I answer also? Well, I share quite similar opinion about pedestals, that me as an artist I also don't like. I prefer everything to be much more directly face to face to the viewer without elevating it from the ground. So I cannot comment on it a lot.
May I have a comment? Mike. just mention one example where pedestal is meant to sacrifice the subject matter. In our show, a bigger piece, smaller piece, the work by Evita, the small bronze Putin, is on pedestal. He's painted like Easter eye, so it is this pedestal adds thematically to desacralization of the subject matter. So, and I think it's very much in place.
Yeah.
Okay.